It is currently a dark and stormy morning where I'm at, so if you hear rain in the background, I hope you enjoy a nice and gloomy atmosphere for this week's Beetlegust. Seriously, there's a flash flood. It's a lot of rain. So, welcome to the third video in Beetlegust. In this series, I'm going to be making Beetlejuice miniatures all August long. Today I will be showing you how I made both the Scuba Diver and the Magician's Assistant for the Beetlejuice Waiting Room. Because the last video was so clothing heavy, I decided to pick one of the characters that had the least amount of clothing. However, I failed to take into account that he also has the most accessories. The most. So let's get started creating the Scuba Diver. I'm very much enjoying the fact that I had pre-packaged these dolls because I can just grab them whenever I'm ready to get started. I have all the lists of everything I need to make and as many materials that I already have at my fingertips. So for the scuba guy, I already had a shark. I knew I was going to need one a while ago, so when I saw one, I purchased it. I also have all of the body parts and some fabric. I'm putting his body parts together with pipe cleaners just like I did in the previous video, so I'm going to skip over that since it's fairly similar. However, he is going to be missing one leg because it's going to be replaced with a shark. Because he's only wearing shorts and you can see all of his upper body, I'm going to have to do something about the joints where his shoulders attach to his torso. I'm also going to be placing his head permanently, so I had to decide where to place it. I'm going to be sculpting a fake leg on the other side because that's going to be easier than trying to remove the upper portion of a porcelain leg. To do a lot of this, I'm going to be using epoxy sculpt. I started by using it underneath the arms in the armpit area, and I needed this to cure completely before I could work on the top of the arm. It kept moving around while I was working and it was really frustrating, so that's why I decided to just work on the underside. At this point, I had also worked on his neck. I had some leftover epoxy sculpt, so I decided to go ahead and make a fin. I couldn't really see what he was wearing on his feet, however, I'm assuming it was a fin since he has the rest of the scuba gear. Thankfully, I just had to make one of these because the other leg is in a shark. I decided to just make the flat part of the fin and allow that to cure completely before working on the top part of the fin because I knew that would be a little bit too fiddly. While that was curing, I could work on the upper part of the shoulders. Using epoxy sculpt made my doll really strong, but it also added a ton of dry time. And that's because it actually cures. There's a chemical reaction that happens, and so you can't really rush it with a fan like you can with paper clay. I decided he was just a little bit too thin. I think they make these dolls thinner so that when you add the clothing there isn't too much bulk, but I wanted to make his sides a little bit wider, so I added some epoxy sculpt there as well. I added a bit more clay to the top of the upper thigh because I needed the shorts to be a little bit shorter. And then I made the other leg, which is going to be the leg that goes into the shark. So to make the transition from man to shark a little bit easier, I made it thinner on one end. Now that the fin was cured, I could go ahead and attach that to the foot by using a little bit more epoxy sculpt to go over the top of the pre-made foot. Because none of my doll's feet seem to be able to hit the floor once they're sitting in the chair, the fin helped make up for this. And I also, at this point, thought of another idea for his extra leg that will help me in the future. So I'm going to go ahead and take that and I'm going to swap out one shark for one leg. And at this point, I keep thinking how unlucky this guy is. It's already hard enough to walk in fins, and now he has to drag around a shark too. Speaking of the shark, I'm going to go ahead and start working on trying to form it into something that will work for my project. Unfortunately, the shark that I found, its mouth is fairly closed. Because it's plastic, I'm going to try warming it up and forcing it into the shape I want it to be in. This shark was extremely tough, so this took quite a bit of time and force to try and get it to work. The shark in the film has a knife stuck into its head, obviously in defense. The scuba diver was trying to save himself, which, as we know, failed. And so I had to make a little hole in the head for the knife. I also need to form the body so that it sits flat against the floor. So once it's attached to the scuba diver, it has a more realistic weight to it. I ended up needing a more industrial heat gun by the end of it because this shark was so tough. I kept checking back and forth between the scuba diver and the shark to make sure everything I had done so far would work. And it may not look like I did very much, but it does have a much more natural look once it's on the floor. Now it's time to give the scuba diver his signature green. In the past video, I decided to use chalk pastels to change the color of the chicken man who needed to be red. This time I'm deciding to go with acrylic paint all over the body, and then I will use chalk pastels to make a little bit of differentiation in the skin tone. I also couldn't resist painting his little toenails. Now I'm going to be using the chalk pastel and looking at a reference photo, making some highlights and some shadows in areas that I want to accentuate. It seemed like the costume designers really wanted him to have a set of abs, so I'm making sure to make that apparent. I'm also adding a little bit of brown and of course the signature black of his eyes that look like typical Tim Burton eyes. They're just very, very dark. This is how he looks after a spray of Mr. Super Clear. In the movie, I could tell he had some sort of blue swim trunks on. I'm not sure if they were supposed to be denim, but I had this blue fabric and I thought it was really fun. So I'm going to be making a very simple pair of shorts, similar to the way I made the pants in the last video, however, they're just shorter. And I did have a few issues because he is permanently sitting, and I don't really have a coat to cover up the back part of the pants if they're not looking good. So I decided to make my own pattern in which it has a much larger panel on the back. And this way I could cross over the pieces of fabric and then I could take a pencil and mark out where the hem was going to be. Making clothing for a doll that's just standing versus a doll that is sitting is very different. And in the past video, I just kind of hid the ugly parts of the back of the pants, but I felt like this time I really wanted to try and make it look nice. So I'm going to be custom hemming it. And as you can see, I'm just using a pencil to mark it out. Once I'm happy with the cut and the fit, I'm just going to use glue like I had in the past. Glue everything down, hit it with the clover iron really quickly so that I know everything is cured and staying in place. I'm also going to be making a little band that's going to go around the top of the shorts. This is just going to cover up any raw edges and make my swim trunks look like they're finished and fit to his body really, really well. This is how it's looking so far. I decided not to mess up the one side of the pants leg with shark bite marks, so I'm just going to leave that for now. I also decided I didn't want my shark to be permanently attached to my scuba diver, so I'm going to be using a magnet system similar to the one I do for the Beetlejuice house walls, where I'm going to be attaching magnets to, or at least one magnet to the scuba diver's leg, and then I'm going to be putting the other magnet inside of the shark's mouth. The reason for this is that the shark is very heavy. It's just pure thick plastic. It's very heavy and very cumbersome for me to hold the shark and the scuba diver at the same time. So I'm going to embed the magnet into the shark's mouth and then cover it with paper. This is going to keep the magnet from coming out. And then I'm going to cover all of that with glue and paint. I'm doing a similar process on the scuba diver's leg. I'm adding quite a bit of glue and then just kind of scrunching it around the magnet. So it's kind of a band-aid holding the magnet onto the end of the leg. And then I'm going to be painting it so that it blends in, and I am painting this area a darker green. Eventually, I will also add some black to the very end and some black inside of the shark's mouth so that when the two meet, there is more of a subtle transition from the end of the leg into the shark's mouth. And this worked surprisingly well. These are rare earth magnets, so they're pretty strong. They are lessened a little bit by the paper, which is okay, because I really just want them to hold on to each other and not pull the magnets off when I decide to detach them. Now I can go ahead and start painting the face. I had a hard time with the eyebrows this time. I can't even get my own eyebrows to actually match, so painting them on a very tiny doll was very difficult. I think I had an easier time with the scuba diver than I do with the magician's assistant in the end. I always enjoy putting the pupils or the irises into the eye. For all of my dolls, I'm just going to be using plain black because they are so small. I had a hard time with his mouth because it does look like his lips are very dark, but it doesn't look like lipstick. It looks like just a dark area around the mouth, so I tried my best to replicate that. Now it was time to add some hair. I'm going to kind of go through this quickly as well because I've done men's hair many times, but I'm just going to lay it out with some brown paint so I know where to put it, and then add some viscose on top, slowly sculpting it with some glue water until I like how it looks. His hair isn't super important because soon it's going to be covered with a scuba mask. With some of my leftover epoxy, I made a snorkel, but I still have a knife, a scuba tank, a leg holster, and I already did his brown hair. And then finally, I have a weight belt that he needs. This is why I say he has just the most accessories. So let's get started on the mask because that's going to be directly applied to his body. To get the mask shape, I taped two pencils together so that I could start wrapping some paper around them, and then I was pushing down in the center between the two pencils so that I would get a kind of a binocular type shape. I specifically wrapped it with paper that was too big so that I could slowly cut it down to the size that I thought looked correct. If I had made it too small, then I would have to start over, so starting a little bit bigger made sense. Once I was happy with the size, I could go ahead and start painting it black. Each time I messed with it, I made sure that I shaped it back into its binocular shape because these were really delicate as I was working on them. Next, I grabbed a piece of acetate to make the front part of the goggles. I just added glue to one side and then glued them flat onto the acetate and then cut around the shape. So now it's glued to the front of the goggles. To make sure that the acetate would never pop off, I used some shiny Mod Podge to go over the front and down the side, so I had an extra layer of protection, making sure they would be stuck forever. I then painted the snorkel that I had previously made out of epoxy sculpt off camera. I used some of the black faux leather that I had made out of fabric and made a strap that was going to go on the mask and then loop around the back of the scuba diver's head. Off camera, I glued this on because it was a little bit fiddly, but this is how it looks once it's applied. Then I could glue on the snorkel on one side near the ear, and I just made sure that it looked like it was hanging down naturally. And this is how the mask and snorkel look so far. For the weight belt, I just cut some little squares of mat board, and I painted them gray, and then I painted silver on top of that. Then I used some of that same faux leather that's painted black. I made a thicker piece and then a thinner piece. The thinner piece is going to go on top and it's going to go over each one of the little tiny silver pieces that are looking like the weights, or I hope look like the weights. I'm going to glue that on top so it looks like they're stuck in the belt. The weights are what help the diver go below the water, so he's not just constantly fighting the fact that his body is buoyant and wants to go up. Once I was happy with the belt, I could go ahead and glue it in place on top of his swimming shorts. Now it's time for the leg holster. This was just a simple piece of that faux leather that was folded over. I left a toothpick in the fold so it was slightly open. This is not going to have a knife in it because the knife was used and you will see it elsewhere. I'm making very thin pieces of the faux leather. I'm just going to glue that onto his leg, and then I can glue the holster on top of those little pieces. And then this was just a really easy detail to add, but I do think it just continues the story of what's going on with the scuba diver and how he ended up in the waiting room in the first place. So now I can go ahead and mark these off my list and finish the last two items. To create the tank, I was just going to go with polymer clay, and this is some Arteza clay I've had for a while. I'm going to be rolling it into a snake with a domed side on one end, and then I'm using a toothpick to stick into one side because this is going to be my valve that's sticking up at the top. Once I was happy with the size, I used a blade to cut off one end, and then I just rolled it a little bit more to make sure it kept its size. Now this is not going to be a perfectly cylindrical tank, but it does the job, so I'm happy with it. I then rolled a flat snake of clay that's going to go around the top of the toothpick. Then I'm going to do the same thing for the bottom. This is just giving a little bit of detail to the tank. I probably could have done this out of epoxy sculpt as well, but I was really tired of waiting for things to cure, and the polymer clay can be baked immediately. Speaking of, I baked this according to the package directions. While that was baking and cooling, I decided to make the little vest that needs to be attached to the tank. After all, that's how the scuba diver wears the tank underwater. I'm using some of that same faux black leather that I had made with fabric, and I'm just going to cut out a generic vest shape. This does not have to be perfect, and it does not have to fit my diver because it's just going to be kind of lumped over to one side attached to the tank. It looked a little bit too flat, so I decided to line the inside with some gray fabric that was going to give it a little bit more thickness. I just glued it on and then cut off the excess. Now I can start shaping it so that it looks more like a vest. I also needed to add a few more straps, and honestly, in the end, I'm not sure you're even going to see these details, but I know they're there. There has to be some straps so that the vest can actually stay on the scuba diver's body. To make some little clasps to hold the straps together, I am just going to be painting some black cardstock with silver, and then I'm going to fold that in half with some glue in the center to make it a double thickness. Once that's dry, I can cut it into strips and then just cut the shapes that I think will work for the clasps on the vest. I did a couple little triangles and then some hourglass shapes, although in the end, like I said, I'm not sure you see really all of them. I'm just going to add these onto the ends of the straps, and then in the end I will have a vest that looks like a little scuba vest. And I think it looks okay. It's not accurate, it's not going to be perfect details, but it's good enough for this project. I went ahead and filled any imperfections in my tank once it had cooled, and then I decided to paint it a dark silver. So I'm starting with a flat coat of black, and then I'm going over it with silver on the outside, and that's going to give it just a little bit of shine. In order to attach it to the vest I just created, I'm going to pre-wrap it with some of that same faux leather. Once this is wrapped, it's going to give it an easier place to glue on to the back of the vest. And while I was in gluing mode, I decided to go ahead and glue a bead to the end of a piece of wire, and later on this is going to be my valve that goes onto the scuba tank, but I wanted to go ahead and glue it so I could let it dry. And now I can finally merge the tank with the back of the vest. And once that's dry, I can start pushing down the ends of the vest to make it look more natural. I want it to look like it's slumped over, the vest has weight, and it's kind of pushing against the floor or sitting flat against the floor, because what's really holding it upright is the tank. So it took a little bit of moving the pieces around, but I'm okay with how it looks. It's not perfect, but I think it gives the effect that I want. To complete the top of the tank, I'm going to go ahead and cut off any of the excess toothpick, and then I'm going to take that wire I was using earlier, and I'm going to glue that perpendicular to the toothpick. Once the glue has taken hold, I'm just going to take some embroidery thread and I'm going to wrap that around the wire and the toothpick. That's going to give it a lot of strength, and I don't have to rely on just one little dot of glue to hold these pieces together forever. I bent the wire so that it looks like it's hiding behind the tank, and this is so I don't have to make any more attachments. I just decided to hide it, and I think the wire along with the tank do enough to let people know what they're looking at. So now I'm just going to do a final coat of black over these pieces, and that is the tank finished. I'm actually pretty happy and surprised with how it came out. And so now it's time to work on the knife that goes in the top of the poor shark's head. I don't think either one of them won in this situation. They both ended up in the waiting room. I cut out a little diamond shape that's going to be the handle of the knife, and I'm going to use my hand drill to drill a hole through it that's about the right size for the toothpick. Now I don't actually have to put a real blade on this knife because it's going to be glued on top of the shark, and it's just going to be implied that the blade sunk down inside of the shark. So anyway, so I am going to be focusing on the handle. I'm wrapping that with some embroidery thread, and then I can cut off the rest of the toothpick, and I'm just going to top off the blank top part of the toothpick with just like a little sequin type domed piece, and that is going to be the handle for my knife. Now that can be put into the dent that I had previously created by using the heat gun, and that's just going to be glued in place with some super glue. Poor little shark, although we know he's not really impaled. It is kind of like a tiny hat, if you want to think of it that way. I did think he looked a little too nice, bright, shiny, and clean, so I added a little bit of watered down black paint around the wound area, and then it was time to put this all together. The shark snapped easily into place because of the magnet, and everything else was attached to the scuba diver except for his tank, and I could just put that to the side, although he does take up quite a bit of floor space. He's just, he's high maintenance. He needs a lot of room. And at this point, Stormy and I did a happy dance because this one was finished. So you may be asking, where's the blood and gore? Where's the red? Fun fact, at a certain depth underneath the water, your blood is actually green. I know this because my scuba diving parents showed me a video of one of their friends getting bit by an eel when I was very young. For fun! And his blood was green. So maybe that's why the scuba diver is entirely green? I don't know. So now we're on to the next doll, which has less accessories, but more gore. Now we're on to one of my absolute favorites, the magician's assistant. She was a very specific order because her legs have to cross. These are all the materials I have to begin with, but before I can put anything on her body, we have a too much body situation, whereas she has 2 sets of hips. So I had to figure out how to remove the bottom part of this porcelain cast body. I tried to use a glass. It's like a little tool where it helps you score glass and then you can like break the glass, but that was not working. So I very hesitantly and with a lot of fear decided to just break it bit by bit with some pliers. Surprisingly, these little bodies are super strong. I just slowly chipped away at the bottom of this torso until I felt like I had removed enough. Now she's still going to have a very long, disproportioned body, but it's going to look a little bit more screen accurate with the bottom half removed. She is also going to have a similar situation to the diver where you can see the upper portion of her arms. So I'm going to be using epoxy sculpt to make that a little bit more smooth, and I added some epoxy sculpt to the bottom of her torso as well so it wasn't so jagged. Then I could use some blue paint because she does have a blue skin tone in the waiting room and go over her entire body, including her legs that are going to be crossed. Once I had done my first layer of paint, I could tell that my epoxy sculpt was a little bit lumpy, which it's hard to tell on this camera because I had kind of overexposed it, but it was a little bit too lumpy for my liking and it just didn't look right. So I decided to try some wood glue mixed into the same color paint, and I went over that area hoping to smooth it down a little bit. It did help, but then I also went back with some sandpaper once it had dried. And I did this a few times, going back and forth between the glue paint mixture and sanding until I was happy with the smoothness of my sculpt. After that was done, I did a final layer of the paint without the glue in it so that everything looked cohesive. Then it was time to work on her complexion with some chalk pastel. This is done the very same way I did on the diver, except for her, I'm using a little bit of purple. I could tell in the movie she had some purple mixed in and maybe a little bit of dark green, although I definitely used more purple. I tried to get as much as I could into the eye area, but I do end up adding a little bit more later when I'm painting because I just can't get it dark enough. I sprayed her with some Mr. Super Clear to protect my work. After that, I could use Mr. Scuba Diver's leg for a test subject for the Fishnet Stockings. I have never done fishnet stockings before. This is a piece of black tulle, which I know is going to work perfect, but I'm not quite sure how to apply them. My first idea was to use Mod Podge, and thankfully this worked pretty well. I'm adding a line of Mod Podge across the front part of the leg, and then I'm just going to lay my tulle into the Mod Podge. Once that's starting to take hold, I'm going to get a little bit more of the Mod Podge on my brush and go over the top, making sure that the tool is pushed flat against the leg. Then I'm going to let this dry. This was probably the most frustrating part of the process, was waiting for each layer to dry. Once it's dry, I can go ahead and add more Mod Podge to the side of the leg and then push the piece of tulle down into the glue. I decided to do one part of the leg at a time, so I cut a slit where the knee is going to be, and I'm just working on the lower half of the leg, and later on I'll be working on the upper half. After both sides are glued down, I'm going to cut very close to the back of the leg so that the seam of the stockings is going to be on the back of the leg. That way, if it doesn't look very nice, it's not going to be seen, and if there was a seam in stockings, it would be towards the back anyway. Again, I'm adding more glue, more Mod Podge, and then I'm just going to be gluing it down and holding it until it dries. And this is how it looks so far. It looks kind of like a mess, but the lower part of the leg, it does fit pretty tight, and I'm happy with it. Then I can go back and do the same process on the upper part of the leg, making sure if there's any creases that need to happen, they happen near the knee. So I'm going to be doing this same exact process that I just explained onto the real leg. Of course, I'm being even more careful because there's a layer of paint, but I'm going slow and just making sure I like each section that I glue down before I continue on. It took me 2 hours to put the stockings onto the magician's assistant, and in the end, I like how it looked. It may not be perfect, but I think it's going to function for the purpose of this doll. So this is the result I got in the end. And as you can see, they had to be tight close to the leg, otherwise I'm not sure I could have gotten her to cross her legs. Once I was happy with the result and got her sitting onto the couch, I could tell, just like all of my other dolls, that her feet did not touch the floor. So I'm going to be giving her some rather high heels so that it does look a little bit more natural once she's sitting on the couch. Also so that her shoes can help support the upper part of her body. I'm using some barbecue skewers, and I'm just going to cut off the pointed end of each barbecue skewer, which are usually the parts that I cut off. So in this case, I wanted to keep that part. I'm going to glue it onto the bottom of the heel using some gel super glue and some tacky glue together. These two glues together take hold really quickly, so I don't have to sit there and hold them in place. However, I am going to let this dry completely before I start creating the rest of the shoe. This is going to make sure that I don't have to worry about the heels as I'm sculpting, and if they are a little bit too long, I can cut off a little excess of the heel later. I'm starting with epoxy sculpt and making a larger sole for the front part of the shoe to give it a little bit more height. Then I'm going to lay out a snake of clay and roll it flat. I'm going to start like I did with my leather shoes that I created in the last video. However, of course this is clay, so it's a little bit easier to move and force to do what I want it to do. After I've got it laid down onto the foot, I can use a sculpting tool to start pushing it underneath the heel. When I'm happy with how it looks, I can cut off any excess on the toe and then start shaping that as well. In my head, I was just picturing a Barbie high heel and trying to get something that looked like that. Again, this was a long process of slowly sculpting and taking off clay where I thought it didn't work, and moving the legs back and forth to make sure they looked good from all angles. They're not perfect, but for my first high heel I've ever made, I'm pretty happy. I decided to go ahead and cut off a little more because they were pretty long heels, and then I could go ahead and glue the sides of the legs together. I knew it would be easier to work on the shoes while the legs were apart. As I'm gluing them together, I'm just making sure that the crossed legs look natural, and then I'm going to move to my third clay of the video. Now we're moving on to paper clay. Again, this is because I'm tired of waiting for the epoxy sculpt to cure. This clay is going to be at the very top of her hips, and this is where her injury is going to be. And if you don't know, she is the magician's assistant, and the joke is that she was sawed in half for real. So I don't know if this is morbid, but I thought the best way to get the texture I needed from a saw was to use an actual saw. So I went and got one from the garage and just started making marks into the top of the wet clay. And I went back and forth trying to make lines, but in the end I just started pushing down into the clay, and eventually I got a texture that was just kind of a mess, but I do think it looks more like a saw mess than I would have gotten by just trying to use some other sculpting tools. While that part of her body dries, I decided to go ahead and work on her dress. This material, thankfully, does not fray at the edges, and it's rather stretchy. So I was thankful that I could just cut long ribbons of fabric and basically just glue it to her body. I'm doing this in layers, kind of like a dress that has several layers basically from the top to the bottom, and I'm just gluing it along the bust line so that it's close to her body. Now she does have a neck piece that matches her dress, so I'm using a circle template to try and figure out what is going to be the best size for that neck piece. I cut out the circle and then I cut a slit into it and then cut another circle that's very small on the inside so that there was room for her neck once I had put it onto her body. Again, I'm just gluing it in place. There's no need to hem this material, which is making this outfit extremely easy to make as compared to the ones I made in the previous video. For her body, she also needs a skirt made out of the same material, so again, I'm using a circle template to try and figure out which one is going to work the best. The body skirt is going to be the same process as the neck skirt that I previously created, which means I'm cutting out a circle and then a slit that goes down to a smaller circle. Then it's going to be as easy as gluing it around her injured area and making sure that I just do a careful hem in the back so that the back of the skirt looks like it's finished. I really like the way this fabric falls. I think it looks really natural. However, I did reinforce some of the ways that this skirt naturally fell to make sure it stayed in place. And then I put some black fabric over her rear end so that there was a nice cushion between her and the chair, especially because the couch is Mod Podged. I don't want her sticking to the couch. Once her outfit was done, I could go ahead and paint her high heels black. I'm not sure if you can see them in the movie, but I just decided that black would probably be the best way to go. Now it's time for a little bit of gore, and I do want to keep the gore at a minimum because I don't want it to be the focus of the room. Even when you see her in the movie, you don't realize until a second pass that she is cut in half. So I'm using some red and brown, and more brown than red to kind of dull down that area of her. And while I had the red out, I decided to go ahead and paint in her very red lips. And of course, why not make sure to paint the fingernails while I'm at it? This magician's assistant also has a beauty mark on her face, which always helps me whenever I'm creating a character if they have a distinctive feature like that, because just automatically it starts to look like the character by adding that one piece. I also need to paint in her eyes, eyebrows, and irises. And the eyebrows, she has some pretty nice eyebrows, and I'm pretty sure I messed them up, so sorry to the magician's assistant. And then I also had to give her some darker makeup because the chalk pastels just weren't getting dark enough for me. And as you can see, it is pretty dark in that area, and I don't think it's just the Tim Burton dark eye dark. I think that's actually stage makeup from her job, so I wanted to make sure and get that in there. Here is her final face paint, and now I'm ready to work on her hair. I was very nervous about her hair as well because it is a beehive hairstyle and I have never done one of those before, but it was a fun challenge. I started with the bangs by laying down a chunk of black viscose and then using my water glue mixture in order to lay the hair down flat. I'm also going to use this to help me with her bangs. She has very zigzag bangs in the front, and this is a great practice for me because Lydia is also going to have very specific bangs in the front, but so far I think it's looking okay. I decided to make the back of her hair by adding a U of this viscose material around the back and then blending it into the front of her hair just above the bangs that I just created. Next, I needed to cover the back of her head above the U that I just created. So to do this, I'm going to add some glue in the center and start adding a very long piece of the black viscose. I'm going to add it into the glue and then start winding it around the back of her head to fill in any gaps. This is the point in which it's really helpful that I did the painted black area where her hair is going to go first, because I'm pretty sure if I hadn't done that, you would be seeing some blue showing through at this point. So now that I have this wrapped around her head in the back, I'm going to add another line of glue and then force the hair to go up towards the front. So basically it's going to look like she has a ponytail coming off the front of her head. At this point, I'm going to let everything dry really well, because the next step is going to be piling all this hair on top of her head. So this is my final stick down on the back of the head. I'm just going to let this front piece sit there for a while everything dries. Now that it's dry, I'm going to take the leftover hair and I'm just going to twirl it until it starts curling in on itself. As it starts curling in, I'm going to pile it on top of the head, trying to get a lot of volume. And I know my hands are in the way, so I'm sorry about that, but I'm going to try and show you as best as I can. I'm going to carefully take some glue, and I kind of did this off camera because it was hard to see, glue those curls in place, and then take the final little bit of the hair, make it flat, and then wrap it around the front to give that beehive look. Then I'm going to glue it in the back, smooth it all down with my glue water mixture, and that is the final beehive look for my magician's assistant. And yes, if you put her together, she still has some weird body proportions, but we're not going to think about that now because she will never be placed that way. She will be placed side by side or across the room from herself. So now that I have her hair done, the only two things left on my list are a bracelet and a book. The bracelet's going to be pretty simple because I have some of these little rhinestones that I'm just going to be gluing around her wrist. I'm not going to even try to put it on a string. I'm just going to glue it straight onto her because it's something that's never going to have to come off. I'm using a pick-me-up tool that's made by Silhouette. This is really helpful when it comes to placing little tiny things like this. And I'm just going to slowly glue the rhinestones around her wrist, and voila, we have a bracelet. Now for the book, I wanted to do something similar to the Chicken Man where it had a personal message in it. This little pre-made book says notebook on the front, and for the inside I printed off a diagram that shows the actual trick and how it's supposed to be done, and I used a pencil to make like little notes. So I don't know if it's the magician's assistant that was making notes in the notebook, or maybe she found the magician's notebook and found out he actually did know how to do the trick officially. So you can let me know which one you think it is. Was it a mistake or was it malice? I added the book into her hands so she can be checking it out while she's in the waiting room, and here is her finished look. I'm so happy with how she turned out. I did not expect her hair to come out this good. I was really worried about that. Now that these two are finished, it's time to put them into the waiting room. I am so excited, especially now that there are 5 characters to arrange, and the one that's going to take up the most room, Shark Boy with a scuba tank, I can finally figure out where the best spot for him is going to be and place everyone else around him. After I got everyone in place, I realized, wow, the waiting room is really starting to fill up. It is going to look packed and busy once I get all the rest of the characters in there, which I think is appropriate for the waiting room, seeing as we know how well it works.
Number 54,601.
We have 2 more Beetlegust videos left before I wrap things up. Let's see who's left in the organizational bin that I created. Okay, who's left in here? Chicken Man, you're done. The characters we have left that I have planned to create are the Witch Doctor, the Heart Patient, and Miss Argentina. And I actually do have a photograph of the smashed guy in here, the guy who had a roadside accident. He was an alternate because I wasn't quite sure how sick of making dolls I was going to be by the end of this. So far, I've made 5 dolls and I'm still feeling pumped, so fingers crossed I will be able to make him. However, he won't end up in the waiting room because there's not enough space. So he'll probably go into Juno's office once I make that. That rain is just really coming down now. So that'll be fun audio to edit. I hope you all have an amazing week, a happy Beetlegust, and I will see you in the next one. Bye. I'm gonna take you to show you what is happening outside. My phone literally went off during this. There's a flash flood, so hold on a second. Someone napping over here. Planning to poop inside the house a little bit later today, probably. I'm going to show you outside Studio Tudio here. This is what's happening outside. Wow.